All right.
Okay, crew prep for safer sailing. Let's jump in. So,
And I guess we'll jump in and say also, please feel free to help us keep this interactive.
yeah,
There is a lot of prepared material, but we would love to have your comments, questions, reactions, you name it.
next slide. Let's go. Oh, this is about us. Whatever.
Whatever. We did a thing. We sailed that red line. Our kids started off small and then they got big. Next.
Next. Um, reality check. When talking about safe sailing, offshore cruising and voyaging and all that, I really like to start with a reality about what we're doing. And next slide. And this point is simply that most of us are amateurs. It doesn't matter how long we've been sailing. I've been sailing more than 50 years. I've raced professionally. I've done all these things. We've circumnavigated together, but we're really still amateurs compared to professional um, commercial big ship mariners, the military, the Navy, uh, the
Hopefully,
Coast Guard.
hopefully like these guys with the tugboat and that big barge, which appears to be careening towards our boat.
Yeah. And the difference between us as amateurs and them is that they often go through a lot of training to become licensed, and they have a lot of resources in that training to keep up their licenses. So they may have simulators for big ship practice for lots of different situations. They've got engineering staff. They have all of these features that we don't. And at the end of the day, we may be really good sailors. We can't practice everything. There's lots and lots about our lifestyle where it relies on us to figure it out as we go and to manage those tricky situations where these people probably have simulated it and practiced it, and they have accountability for it in ways that we don't. So keep in mind that we're amateurs. It doesn't mean we're bad. It just means we're maybe not quite as practiced at all the things, and that we should always consider ourselves learners. There's always room to improve. So this is us. This is a situation early when we were cruising, and it is talking to the kids about safety.
In ways that are not intimidating.
Yeah, yeah. Kids can easily be scared. Our partner can be scared. Some of the stuff that we're going to cover today are unfortunate situations, and we bring them up to show that things can go badly, but there are ways to manage things better. And it starts with things like this, with crew meetings, and with communication, and to understand that we all have better skills and lesser skills, but everybody on the boat has eyes and ears and feel and a sense of smell and vibration. These are all important inputs on managing the things that come flying at us on the boat. Smoke out of a shorted out electronic device at 2 o'clock in the morning, sailing from Bermuda to Stonington, Connecticut, for example, which we experienced. So we're all out, we're all trying to be safe and doing the right things. And every once in a while, you can be in the middle of nowhere, have a pretty tough situation evolve, and it's kind of on us mostly, if not entirely, to manage that situation. This is us in
Yeah,
Colombia.
in this case, we're off the coast of Colombia,
Mhm.
and we had chosen to make a passage across the top of South America from Santa Marta, Colombia. Our destination, our intended destination was Ovaldia, Panama, that far end of Panama. And we were doing it in late January. And what that means is it's during the Christmas winds. So this is the reinforced trade winds that give an already challenging stretch of the Caribbean probably the biggest seas that we saw in our entire circumnavigation. And what does Murphy's Law dictate then? That our steering cable broke.
Yeah, the chain actually broke. And so we were able to fortunately manage it pretty well, big seas, but we maintained steerage. We were able to, after 60 miles of that, find a place to pull off and rebuild the steering cable linkage with Dyneema splicing to the end of the chain, pick up the next day and get going. And that little Band-Aid fix held for like the next 5,000 miles.
So yeah, there's Jamie splicing the Dyneema
Yeah,
right onto the
10
chain.
o'clock at night. Anyway, let's move on. So the notion that we're out there we're living this alternative, unscripted lifestyle. We're looking for fun with fish and all the other great things. And at the end of the day, we're all just human, and that human component has features that I think when you go cruising, voyaging, are really important to think a little bit about. And so we'll talk about those. So as humans, we tend to have a fight or flight response. This is not something that we can naturally control. It's about a chemical release in our bodies. And in stressful situations,
Each of us have the one that we're inclined to.
yeah. And so an example of this for us happened early on in our cruising career, 2008. We were coming down the West Coast. We were in Catalina Island, Avalon Harbor, as pictured. And there you've got moorings, your bow and stern moored. And it was like a big drive-in movie theater. And one morning we had a big crash, and we jumped up to the cockpit, and there was a large 50-foot odd power boat that was bashing into another boat. And then it peeled off, and
it
it
was
went
on the outside fairway from where we were.
yeah, and it peeled off, and it bashed into a larger power boat, about a 60-foot power boat.
So it becomes apparent that this large power boat is entirely out of control. There were people running around on the side decks. There was a stressed out dog, and they're trying to figure out how to get this boat back under control.
They weren't actually.
They were stressing
It
out.
was a couple with a
And a
with a
baby.
baby. Mom was completely frozen. Dad was running around in circles and not being effective. And they really both had flight responses. The boat turned and went down a fairway parallel to us, hit another boat, which turned it again and aimed it directly at us. And as it started coming towards us at about picked up to 5 knots. That's a lot of mass at 5 knots. And it's coming towards us. We're in the cockpit, little kids, 4, 6, and 9 years old. And Bean says, "Let's jump overboard." And I said,
I'm not proud.
Not quite yet. Let's just hang on a second. So in the moment, we thinking about it after and not really picking up on this as a feature, Bean has a flight response. During stressful times, she doesn't want to be part of that. And her natural reaction is to go. And whether that's freezing in place or fleeing, literally wanting to flee. Mine is different, although my response in this situation wasn't perfect, because I should have thrown off the stern mooring. And if we got hit, we would have swung away and there would have been less damage.
As it was with the bow and the stern, we were like every other boat, kind of pinned in place.
Fortunately, the stabilizer on the boat caught a mooring line, pivoted just a little bit before breaking free, and then went whooshing behind us and missed us by about 6 feet, 5 or 6 feet. And it was a really close one. We thought we should have maybe bought lottery tickets later that day, but the real lesson was interesting in how we respond to stress, and that response, how it has a huge impact on any given stressful situation. If you're in a squall and you respond by a flight response, your ability to manage your boat is impaired. Now, the message here isn't that if you have a flight response, you shouldn't be out there. That's not the case at all. The point is to learn what your response is. If you don't, but think about when you've had really stressful times in your life, like a car accident or something, and how did you respond to it? Which of these are you? If you're a flight response, there are ways in which you can develop skills to minimize that wanting to depart from the situation, or calm yourself or busy yourself or do something to not be a detriment to getting through the stress, but maybe be neutral or even some help to it.
I think it's pretty common for crews to especially have heightened anxiety before a big passage, before the events like many of you guys are looking at taking off on here soon. And having the conversation about this, what is your response and how might you mitigate the negative impact of your response if it's not a positive one? Again, not proud of the way I reacted, but I sure learned something that day. And it's been really helpful for me in future stressful events we've had to know that I really have to do the deep breathing and stop before we move on.
All right, fear or panic. This is another um, pair of humanness. And fear, I think, is a great feature for cruisers because it's that little voice in the back of your head. It's the light on the dashboard that says, I'm not entirely comfortable with this situation, whatever that situation is. Panic is beyond fear, where you're losing rational control of your actions. Panic is a liability. And so, in stressful situations, and it's similar but different than flight or fight. But do you have that little voice in the back of your head, or do you freak out? And we've seen both. Being a flight person is not a panicker, which is helpful. It makes it easier to overcome, manage that flight response. But knowing these two, this is a funny situation. We're in the Bay of Bengal on the way to Sri Lanka, and I saw the smallest squall I'd ever seen on the radar down below. And
And thought, oh, I'm gonna
it's
pop
like,
up Duck and check that out.
that's strange. And I got up and I'm looking and I didn't see a squall. And then I recognized the the funnel of doom. And this is a really big waterspout near us, coming our way at first. And so we dropped sails, we motored off in the opposite direction. And fortunately, it kind of peeled off at one point, but it was an intimidating couple of minutes. All right, next one.
Let's see here.
Confident or arrogant? Confidence is good. It's good to feel like, okay, this is a tough situation. We're going to have to jibe, and it's late at night, but we've got to because there's land in the way. We can do this. Let's make a plan. Let's be careful about it. Arrogant is knowing that you've got to jibe and the wind is up, and just fling the wheel over and away you go, and the boom comes wailing over and shock loads and causes some failure. Arrogance is this belief that there isn't something that can go wrong. And there's a real gap here between these two. Confident is good, it's helpful. But if you have this arrogance part, and a good example of that, this report is online. Anybody who wants to go and read it, it's the US Coast Guard report of the tall ship Bounty, the replica of the Bounty, when it departed in London, Connecticut, and I think 2012, and headed out into a hurricane that was on the radar and well forecasted. They were coming out of a big refit, and the captain was really arrogant about it. And the report concludes this. This is not my synopsis. This is the U.S. Coast Guard, and basically intimidated the crew into reporting that everybody was ready, everybody was okay, that their station on the boat, on the ship, the engineers roll, the decks roll, they were ready to go, even though they just come out of a refit. They weren't ready to go, and unfortunately, nobody spoke up. They went. The ship was lost, and 2 people were lost with it. So if maybe you're a little too confident sometimes, look in the mirror and ask, in a situation, can something go wrong with this? What am I missing? What detail am I missing? Ignorant or dumb? We're all ignorant when we start cruising, and we've been out a while, and there's situations where we're ignorant about. We just don't have the experience or the knowledge because it's a new thing, this unscripted life that we have. Ignorance, though, if there's a situation we don't know and there's some risk involved, there's some complexity, we're going to go and learn about it. We want to show up to a new country, a new anchorage, and be aware of what are the hazards in that anchorage. Not doing those steps, not taking time to research, prepare, practice, whatever it is, getting more skilled so we're not ignorant anymore, is being dumb. To just wing it, get out there. Well, somebody on YouTube did it, so I'm sure I can do it too. And I can tell you that a lot of things don't make it on the internet. So just because somebody did something and it looked easy, it isn't always easy. So just like with being arrogant, with ignorant, it's okay to not know when we start out doing things, but do the little bit of research, do more than that, practice, talk to people, learn from people that have been there. So you go in with a better understanding and a better outcome. This boat was sailing in Banderas Bay in Mexico.
Right by us,
Yeah.
completely oblivious to their general.
They were racing. This is part of a race. They had no idea. The sail was flogging and flapping, and they're just chatting away. So anyway,
Wind carried the noise away, I guess.
yeah, maybe. Heard or dismissed. Heard or dismissed. So if you've got
This is an interesting one, not just for the folks with kids on board, but
True.
with inexperienced crew.
if you've got crew or partner who is less experienced than you, and they say, I see something, I hear something. Hey, what about the weather today? What's that going to be like? And the person on the boat with the most experience just is dismissive or doesn't show attention to the question. Oh, it'll be fine. I don't see it up there. Then those crew members that are really important part of the eyes and the ears, the sensory inputs that happen on a boat, that's an opportunity to miss things that can happen. And we learned this early on with our daughter Siobhan here. We were sailing in Mexico, and it was kind of a sporty day, actually, pretty rough. And she was in the cockpit looking out ahead, and she was like, I see something shiny in the water in front of us. And we're both like,
we don't see
I don't
anything."
see anything. And then a couple minutes later, she was like, oh, I see it again. There's another one. And it turned out to be they were floats on a long line. And if we kept going, would have crossed the line, but we kind of angled off a bit and went parallel to it. And then we're like, oh, there they are. We can see them too.
Well,
So
she saved our bacon that day because that would have been actually quite devastating potentially.
not devastating, but it would have been complicated.
Rounding Punta de Mita, where there were not enough wind to sail and a lot of rocks, and having our motor disabled by getting it fouled with a log line could have been pretty bad.
So be respectful of the crew. Listen to them, even if what they're asking is obvious or simplistic. Everybody has an important thing to bring into a boat on passage. So the next one is info shared or withheld. So this is a tough one with kids. If we're going on passage and it's going to be lumpy, or if we're talking about and practicing safety on the boat, we don't want to scare the kids. We don't want to talk about things that get them anxious and afraid, because I think with anxiety, people are more prone to seasickness and other maladies that can affect how they are offshore. So there's kind of a balance here, but we always will have a crew meeting, or if we're doing some boat handling maneuver, we talk about it. And on that line, dancing that line of information versus not scaring somebody, is saying, hey guys, look, it's going to be a bit lumpy on this one. It's only going to be for a certain amount of time. Here's what I think it'll be like. But it'll be fine. We're stowed, we're prepared, we know the route. Basically talk through it. And I think it's comforting to know when you get out there, for the kids to know when they get out there, it's like, okay, yeah, this is what I expected. But we're fine because they said we're fine. So it's all good, versus not mentioning so much, getting out there, realizing that, whoa, this is more than we expected. It's very uncomfortable, and making your crew unhappy. So sharing is good.
Expectations.
Tired or fatigued. If you haven't done long passages before, this is a really, really, really important one. So tired, we all know tired. We've all been tired. Fatigued is tired beyond the point of rational thought. When you're fatigued, you can't
Well, you lose your train of thought.
you can't complete a sentence. Your eyes get blurry. It's hard to focus. Your knees are wobbly. Your balance is not right. And if you think you're making a sound judgment, you're mistaken. This is when this is a big cause of boating disasters, is people get fatigued. Maybe a situation happens, it turns into a problem. The problem gets complicated. They're working through it. They're tired because they've been on passage. They get really tired, exhausted. And it's when they go on the side deck and trip and fall. They fall down, people fall down the companionway. They make a poor decision. So really, really know your status. And if you feeling like your tired is edging too far, you must get sleep, work with the crew to figure out how to get sleep, even if it's only 20 minutes, half an hour. That's restorative, at least a little bit. You need to bank sleep early on in a passage.
Even before you leave on the passage, right? Don't, it's so tempting to leave having stayed up late the night before, having worked hard right up until that last day. And I think this is probably especially true with a lot of the passages that are coming up, heading out to the Caribbean.
Mhm.
And knowing that it is so important to have that sleep banked and not to leave with a deficit.
True. So it all boils down to we can be the most salty sailor out there. We can be awesome in our saltiness. But it doesn't really matter if these other features are working against you. How is the crew? How are you ignorant or arrogant? What's the clarity of the situation? Do you understand what's going on? Are you exhausted? Are you fatigued? All of these things have a major, major impact on the outcome. So really give thought to these. If you have a stressful situation, it'll make a meaningful difference if you know where you are in each one of these. So stress happens, problems happen, risk is there, emergencies happen at sea, and sometimes even crisis. And with each one of these things, how we respond to that is what determines the outcome. And so this thing box the problem is what I refer to it as. And the simple point of this is that if there's any of these, a risk, a problem, an emergency, or a crisis, that we do whatever we can to contain it at that status or make it better. But don't let one problem turn into two problems, one emergency turn into two emergencies, or don't let a risk turn into a problem to begin with. If possible, we're containing something rather than cascading failures happening. So with this is not just, Mr. Salty on the boat. This is the whole crew. If you've got a new crew, if you're new to cruising, talk about this. Encourage your family, your crew members to be aware. If something doesn't look right on the boat, if it doesn't sound right, what is the destination you're going to? Is it easy? Is it risky? What's it going to be like going around Cape Hatteras? Is there a low forecast in the weather? What's it like when you leave Chesapeake Bay and there's 75 other boats out there? Are those all some amount of risk? Of course they are. So being aware of these risks can help you manage those and not let them become a problem or worse. So this is a story
It's
about,
pretty benign, doesn't it?
yeah, nothing going on here. This is there was a
Just a dinghy.
couple in Vanuatu. We sailed into Vanuatu, and couple, it was his boat and his girlfriend. She wasn't a sailor, but they were going out for day sail out to an island, and cruising boat towing the dinghy out to the island. And what about now? Is there any risk in any of that? Well, maybe. Um, they went out, they started off towards the island. They got to a point where the wind picked up, it got a bit choppy, and something was happening with the dinghy. I don't know exactly what, wasn't in the story that we had learned about, but something happened with the dinghy, and the guy went back to address the dinghy, and he fell over the back of the boat. His girlfriend wasn't a sailor, did not even know how to turn off the autopilot. Okay. Was there something risky about that? Of course there was. We think that there's not a huge high bar to being a crew on a boat, but there are some fundamentals that are pretty important. She didn't know how to turn off the autopilot. He was gone. He was never seen again. She was still sailing on the boat towards the island surrounded by coral that they were going to. This is a problem. This is now a crisis, actually. This is two emergencies. It could have still been a person overboard rescue and preventing a boat from going on a reef and possibly her destruction. She was very, very lucky And we saw the boat towed in the day that we arrived in Port Vila, and heard the story then, where local Vanuatuan fishermen somehow saw the boat sailing towards the surrounding reef, were able to get to the boat, and these guys in dugout canoes were able to figure out how to stop it going forward enough to save the woman's life and the boat being a wreck. So there are risks all around us, and it's not the paranoid position, but in any given moment, the wrong move, tripping on a line, whatever it is, things can go wrong. And often it's the most benign, non-risky looking things that end up being more complicated and going badly in the water. So talk about what are the risks that can happen, making sure your crew has a basic level of understanding of how to manage the autopilot, of how to drop sails, of how to steer the boat. Doesn't have to be pretty. You can go bashing into a dock if you had to go and tie the boat up and that wasn't your normal role. That's okay.
It doesn't have to be pretty.
Yeah, but do cover some fundamentals. And you can't see risk if you don't go looking for it. There are a lot of dark nooks and crannies on boats. There's lots of parts of boats that maybe we don't have the fullest understanding of, and we put blinders on because
Don't want to know.
we don't want to know, or we don't want to make it worse, thinking that if we touch something,
If it's not broken yet,
right, if it's not
well, if
broken.
it's not broken.
So yeah, we gave a talk in Mexico a few years ago about steering systems and problems happening. And a couple came up after and they said, we've got a problem on ours, we think. We're not sure. Can you check it? And I said, no. I shut them down because I'm mean that way. No. What I really wanted them to
Terrible.
do is to go look
Check it
and
themselves.
dig around themselves and
Mhm.
get over that little that wall of not wanting to cause a problem. And so they did. They were a little put out, but they went, they checked it. They found this on their boat. This was their radial drive, their steering system. And you can see it's quite broken in half. Was this going to be an epic steering failure? You bet. It was long way along its path to failure. There's lots of corrosion in there. The radial drive has a fracture in the middle. The steering cable was chafing,
Sorry, you didn't.
chafing, which degrades stainless steel. So, but they got excited. They got over that barrier by being nudged a little bit. So look in all the dirty places, the dark places. If you don't understand, tiptoe into it. And yeah, you can ask people. I will help you. There's many other people that'll reach out, that'll offer help as well. But don't be shy about trying. So this idea of boxing the problem, we start with risk. If you don't know, well, the risk might be there, and then it's going to be a problem. If you see potential risk and you don't do anything, yeah, it's gonna be a problem that manifests itself. If it's a big enough thing, it might be a true emergency, like a person overboard, a dismasting, a fire. There's all sorts of bad stuff that can happen. And then a crisis, to my mind, is a different animal altogether. You can have a really bad thing like that person falling overboard. That's a horrible emergency, but it's so much easier to manage as a single event than it is to have multiple emergencies or emergency and a couple of problems. That's a crisis. It's way more complex to manage that. So we really put an emphasis on containing it or boxing the problem. And an example of that is this. This didn't turn out to be, I don't know the outcome. This didn't fail, but I was walking down the dock and I saw this boat with the bowsprit. That's the Kranz iron, the bail around the bowsprit with the tang and the headstay attached. And you can see the toggle over the tang is offset to one side. And you can also see the toggle's rusting only on one side. Now, as a rigger, I can tell you that's happening because the loads are misaligned on the toggle. The toggle's getting torqued. It's point loading on the part of the clevis and the toggle and the tang. But dark red rust like that, the stainless steel's failing. It's failing badly. And okay, that's a risk. It's not failed. You see that? What do? Well, you get a rig inspection. I would call that out, number one, you have a problem here, replace the toggle, and then put spacers in so the toggle is centered over that tang. Boom, problem contained, no problem, it's boxed. If you don't do that, well, that exists there, and then you go out on a lumpy, bumpy day, you're shock loading the rigging, the headstay, you're dismasted. Well, now you've got an emergency that you're dealing with. But what if the dismasting, the mast falls back, the boom swings over, hits somebody? What if it comes down and swings into the hull and fractures the hull? Now you've got multiple emergencies and something that was very, very easily resolved and very easily identifiable. Walking by in the dock, it was like a beacon. It was so obvious. Here's a real tragedy. I actually don't even like talking about this one. This happened earlier this year. This was a very nice high-end cruising boat with a pretty experienced couple. They had sailed
They
across the Atlantic.
Cruising World's Boat of the Year last year.
Yep. They crossed the Atlantic. They went around through the Caribbean. They were going up to Bermuda. They left Bermuda to sail up to the Canadian Maritimes, about 300 miles east of Cape Cod, in bad weather, not horrible weather, but weather that probably needed a little bit more management than they were doing. They had 2 crew with them. They were reefed. This is a boat with in-boom furling reefing, and the wind picked up. And the report states that the captain, he expected the wind was going to drop off. So they originally only put 1 reef in, but the wind picked up higher. They were going to put in a 2nd reef. They turned the boat into the wind. In doing so, creates a lot of complexity. You should be able to reef your boat at any angle and not turn into the wind, but they did. In doing so, the main came flailing into the middle of the boat, flogging like mad. The main sheet was not pulled tight quick enough and was flailing around. It hit the woman and knocked her down unconscious. He saw it and he went back to help her, and the main sheet hit him, shattered his lower leg. He bled to death and she died not long after. The Coast Guard was called. The crew members pushed the EPIRB button. The Coast Guard was there at the boat, and they
Less than 2 hours.
yeah,
It
less
was
than
incredible. They were way offshore, right?
300 miles out. The Coast Guard was there less than 2 hours. They attempted to rescue the people, but that didn't work. Of the couple, the 2 crew members were rescued. The boat was left adrift until it was later salvaged. So stress is weather that gets beyond what you set up for or mentally prepared for. Stress is in a situation misreading the weather forecast. Stress is going because Mr. Salty down the dock said it was good, even if you're not comfortable, and you went. This is how stress happens and how quickly it can get away from us. Here's an example of sailors that had an instant emergency that they actually boxed beautifully, managed it really well. So they left,
Right.
gosh, it was just about a year ago? No, it was
This was in
January.
It'll be
Interesting.
2 years in January.
Okay, yeah. And they had a rigging report less than a year before they departed on this passage to go from Bahamas to the Caribbean. And the rigging report called out the rigging is fine. But if you look at the inset picture, it's a insulator for an SSB, and it looks like it's been through a fire. This was the point of failure, but the part that's not failed, you can see the surface of this thing. And simply the rigger missed it. And I'm a sailmaker and a rigger, and I'll tell you, we can't see everything. This one was fairly blatant, I think, to my mind, but we can't see everything. Anyway, they had this fresh rigging inspection. They went from Bahamas. They were about 60 miles southeast of San Salvador. the mast fell down. It broke because the backstay failed. And they were coaching clients of ours, but they inReach messaged us immediately. This just happened. They had the presence to do that. They did not rush into this mess of tangled wires and mass moving around. They assessed what was going on. They started communicating by getting in touch with us, and we could advise them. And then we could be a resource. It's not about us, but it's that they made really good moves. And the first thing that I replied with is, do not get hurt trying to do anything right now, because then you make this way more complicated. The short version is, then we gave some ideas on how to manage the situation, but it was really on them. We looked at the weather forecast. It was slowly degrading, but by dark, it was going to be picked up winds, probably 25s. So they had a clock ticking on managing all of this. Bigger sea state,
And
8,
they had a
10 foot
situation
seas.
on their destination too, coming into the Bahamas when most ports were closed because of the pandemic, and needing some special dispensation to be able to arrive in a place that was not blessed as a destination
Yeah, we
or
were
as a port of entry.
we got in touch with the Miami Search and Rescue Coordination Center and let them know, as this is a possible concern, which they loved having the heads up on. They were never called or needed.
But it meant that if things escalated, they had all of the data immediately at hand.
Yeah. So part of boxing the problem is communicating quick and early, getting resources helping you, even if it's not as devastating as the dismasting. This could be a minor or a maybe problem.
Proactively communicate to help keep that problem boxed.
Yeah, because if it manifests into something, well, then it gets more complicated. But they got it all tied up. They got into San Salvador. They then motored back to Florida. They spent some time re-rigging. They're now down in Grenada or somewhere in the southern
Environs, Southern Caribbean.
having a good time. So the key point here is that there's always stuff that's not right about our boat. No matter how much time we spent, God, I've spent gobs of time making things right on our boat, and there's always a gremlin somewhere. So that's there. Our interpretation of weather, interpretations in a docking maneuver, boat handling, whatever it is, there's always some risks there. And being aware of that and trying to talk through what are the possible points we can fail on this? How can we not do that? Because if it goes to a problem and it spins out, it gets more complex as an emergency, and it gets way more complex as a crisis. And the ability to manage a crisis is difficult. The outcomes, the success rate of outcomes in crisis situation goes down quickly. So can think of it in terms of a scale like that. So solutions, all the gloom and doom stories. How do we not do this beyond just boxing the problem, which is a great start to this? But let's go through some ways to do better at this. I like this quote because I think it is really appropriate for what we do. We all start off not having gone and done this cruising thing before. So you got to know by having done it, but you can't know because you haven't done it. So
Classic catch-22.
yeah. And understand there's two ways that we get better at what we're doing. We have intellectual knowledge, we learn, we take classes, things like that. And then there's the actual practice of that intellectual knowledge, that practice experience, these two things together. And you might be all one so far. So you may have great textbook knowledge, but it doesn't mean you'll get the practice part down without a few flubs in between on that path. So really kind of tiptoe into situations, be cautious with situations of stress, problems, and how you resolve them. So solutions here, practice procedures and documented procedures. These are great ways to do it. Many of you have done person overboard practice, or maybe safety at sea class, or maybe you've gone to a local fire department and set off fire extinguishers. All of these things are practice procedures, and they're terrific. The more that you practice something, the more the outcome is understandable, and you'll avoid the missteps in that. Unfortunately, we can't practice everything like a dismasting. And documented procedures, okay? Whether you're putting down a cheat sheet next to your VHF for how to do a pon-pon or a mayday or a call out, even just a securite, or it's the medical books that we carry with us to help diagnose things because we're not doctors or nurses if we're not those trained medical professionals.
And they're not accessible.
Yeah. Or practice procedures. We take the medical course, which is excellent to do, highly recommended doing that. We're still not doctors and nurses by a long shot. So we have these documented procedures. There's many ways we can do these on the boat. They help make order and sense out of a situation when we don't have that specific knowledge. But know that we can't have documented procedures for everything either. It's hard to write a documented procedure for dismasting when we can't practice or know what a dismasting's like until we've been through one. I've been dismasted exactly once, and
That was enough.
it was interesting. I'd rather not do that again. It was on a racing boat. But these are two great techniques to help with this. Debriefing procedure. Okay, this is something happened. You had an awful anchoring experience. Maybe no drama came from it, but this is about being better as sailors and being prepared for the next time, because maybe the next time you anchor, it's even more complicated. You're anchoring in a squall, you're anchoring around coral or around people who charter, and oh my God, they just get challenging. Debriefing is a situation has happened, and we're going to talk through what we did wrong and how we can do better. The problem with debriefing often is that it feels like there's blame, that somebody is getting their finger pointing at them. And that's not the point here. We don't lay blame. If I screwed up in a boat handling or whatever it is, I do ultimately have to own it. And I believe that firmly, that I take responsibility for that. But it doesn't mean that, I'm an idiot because I did that bad thing on the day. It's about figuring out how to do better. So military, commercial mariners, police, school teachers, so many people in so many professions do this as part of being a professional. They debrief to learn how to do better. Professional athletes, they figure out where they screwed up and fumbled the ball. How do they not do that the next time? This should be an important part of every crew's procedures out there.
So question from the fleet here. I'd love to see a list of resources for practice procedures, as well as a list of things every crew should know how to do together. That's a really, really great point. I think a terrific place to go for this actually is the Cruising Club of America has a list of minimum skills for their safety at sea for couples class. And that's something that we can talk about offline. And what it does is provide a lot of those fundamental skills, which, for example, the woman in the story in Vanuatu, where the man overboard was not recovered, could have benefited from. And they're not just individual skills, they're crew skills, right? They're those basic boat handling and safety skills that we all need to know together, and those basic communication skills. I think that's probably a good place to go for that.
It's a good place. Understand that with the documented and practice procedures, as helpful and meaningful as they are, I can't stress enough that at times they don't cover what situation you're in. So they're like a good roadmap part of the time, and they're confidence building part of the time. But sometimes you have to do jazz. You have to figure it out while you're doing it, which is why debriefing is helpful, because when you do it, you actually get more confident in the fact that, okay, we screwed up. We'll do better next time. We'll be a better crew for it.
And to be clear, the list of resources or a list of procedures is really simple, very, very short and simple. The detail is all in how do you do them on your boat? And that's something for you to come up with, or for you to come up with professional help.
Yep. Okay, virtual procedure. This is one that it may sound wonky, but I think it's brilliantly helpful for cruisers, because we don't have the $5 million simulator that tests us in a virtual situation like big ship captains do when they've got fire, when they've got storms, and all the other things like airline pilots get to have with simulators. Virtual procedures and virtual training is imagining or that thing that keeps you up at night when you're preparing to go cruising. fire, somebody falling overboard, dismasting, whatever that thing is. A lot of cruisers have that. Well, don't let that own you. Think about it. What would I do if that thing happened? I started doing this not knowing it was a thing. It's called a pre-mortem is the other term for it. Um, when we were early cruisers, I didn't like the idea of what if we lose our steering? I think steering's a pretty a helpful feature on a cruising boat, and I didn't like the alternative. And so I started literally on passage one night sailing down the coast of Baja, thinking all through the steering system of the boat, and well, what part of it failed? Well, I'm not sure. There's a failure. I have no idea. And then I would loop through in my head over and over and over again on this watch at night. I would go back to the lazarette. Well, the lazarette was filled with crap. I can't see the quadrant. I can't see the steering cable. If it's broken, it would take me 20 minutes on a moving boat, pitching boat, to kind of pull everything out just to get to where I can get a visual on what might be broken there. And it's led to changes in how we stow things. So this is imagining a problem, imagining your response to it, knowing that in the beginning your response is probably not right, too simplistic. Keep going through it again and again, and then actually walk around and sort of simulate the parts that you can. And then it might lead you to making changes on your boat, like how we store things in our lazarette. I've done this for many parts of these disasters that can happen. It's highly effective, as wonky as it sounds. The last one is a really important one, especially for people that have that flight response or a panicky response, is that figuring out techniques, procedures, ways, and I don't have lots of great things to offer here, other than to say that everybody who goes to sea gets scared sooner or later.
Even Alex Thompson.
Even Alex Thompson. So a professional single-handed offshore racing guy who does these stunts for PR, brilliant stunt. He heeled the boat over, climbed up to the mast, which is about 100 feet tall, jumped on a kite and flew off the top of the mast. That's him sailing away while the boat's sailing still. Insane. But in the Southern Ocean with monstrous seas and ripping along at 25 knots or more, he says it's terrifying. It can be incredibly terrifying, and that's debilitating. And he's developed with psychiatrists, psychologists, whatever, ways to calm himself, to pull back from a situation, to stay rational, to stay present in the situation, rather than having his mind spin up into bad ways. You're all going to experience this sooner or later. If you go out and on that first trip out of Norfolk, maybe there's a low pressure system that comes by and creates bigger conditions crossing the Gulf Stream than you want. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. It can be stressful. Another thing that Alex Thompson talks about doing is having an imaginary conversation with people that have been in the same situations. Maybe you're talking to Joshua Slocum.
It always reminds me of Slocum talking to his ghost captain to calm himself.
We were on a very rough passage to Papua New Guinea, and we had a stanchion that whistled in the wind. And about 5 years after this, we both realized this came up, that whistling sound was so human-like that we actually, when we were both independently on watch, alone, pitch black, blowing up to 50. It was
our companion, our not so silent companion up there, as the pitch would change slightly with the angle of the wind on the stanchion.
And yeah, there was some comfort in, I can't explain why that was, but there was comfort in that. And so give thought to what things can you develop or pull out calming effect from, because
your own talisman or St. Christopher or whatever it is.
Whatever works for you.
St. Brendan. Yeah.
Okay. So a few other points to keep in mind with the crew, with building in safety, with offshore passages. Ditch the schedule. I know that we all do this, no matter how often we say we're not going to go on a schedule. Every cruiser falls into this sooner or later. But when you go on a schedule, it's going to bite you sooner or later. And if you are on a very strict or regimented schedule, it's Tuesday, we must be moving, the weather doesn't look too bad.
You got to stick to your schedule or your marina booking's not going to be good. whatever it is.
Yeah.
You got to be able to pick up the
You-
guests on the next island.
You've got guests
whatever
flying
it
in.
is.
You know what? The
They
guests can
intro-
wait.
You can tell, it's easy to tell yourself as well that that's not going to drive a schedule. It's very hard for it not to actually
Yeah.
drive a schedule.
But schedules get people, cruisers, into problems. Another one is this notion of herd mentality or groupthink, where there's going to be a lot of this with you staging in groups down and Norfolk to get ready to jump. We've seen this many times at inflection points where you're at the edge of the ocean, the edge of a big passage, people get together, we're all talking about the weather. Usually somebody's a little bit louder than the others, or I've got 57 million miles, and so that must mean something, and it really doesn't mean as much as is often made out to. But that group mentality, and what is really important is when you choose to leave the anchorage or the dock, doesn't matter who told you to go, who told you the weather, or it was okay, or you think that there's safety in numbers out there. When you choose to go, it's your choice.
And actually, to insert, this is one of the things we think is especially awesome about Salty Dogs,
Mhm.
that they emphasize it is the captain's decision. Organizing things together is fantastic. The decision ultimately when you take off is the captain's.
Yeah, so important that you be comfortable with the weather that you're going out in, the forecast, the readiness of your boat, all of those things. Super important point, because the group can be very influential. Not going doesn't mean you're wrong, shouldn't be stressful if you
Or
choose
that
not to
anyone's
go.
wrong.
Truly, everybody's boat is different, their tolerance for discomfort is different, their experience levels are all different. Relativity. What relativity means regarding passages is that you may be on the edge of the passage waiting for a weather window, and generally in that time of year, it is 15 knots, 20 knots, generally mild conditions. So relatively simple conditions. If you're getting a forecast that's bigger than that, you can probably wait out the forecast, and the median is going to give you something easier at some point. And the flip side of this is with relativity, if you're in a period of the year, in a region of the year, where you're transitioning, as we are going to be doing, into gales, winter gales in the North Atlantic, where the typical conditions are bigger, weather windows are smaller. What it means is that your weather window has kind of a tighter margin. It's going to be closer to those bigger conditions. And so knowing where you stand in that helps drive whether you can wait longer or whether this is the right weather window, despite it being imperfect. But maybe you shorten up the trip. You don't go all the way to the Bahamas in a straight shot. You go down to Beaufort or Charleston and bail out of the next weather system. So in the big picture, and passenger delivery. So when you're going to go on a trip from A to B, is this one where the conditions are such that they're pretty straightforward? It's going to be a beautiful sail. Great, that's a passage. The wind goes down, go slow, sail as you want, whatever. It's easy. But you can have times where your weather window has a hard stop at the other end of it. And if you're not out of it in time, there are going to be big consequences. You're on delivery mode. If the wind goes down light, you manage the ETA. If you're falling behind, the engine goes on, even if you don't want to burn the dinosaurs. You need to respect that weather window. You're on a delivery. It's okay to turn around. This one is really, really important. People, I think sometimes you go and you feel like you get out, there's jitters, you have a boat problem, somebody's seasick. There's a whole bunch of reasons why there's an option to consider turning around. If you have the thought of turning around, you probably ought to. It's never wrong to do that. We left, I left with some bunch of guy friends sailing from Seattle up to San Francisco to Seattle on Totem, our first passage on the boat. And we had a good weather window. We left at the tail end, at the back end of a low pressure system, benign conditions. We got out by the Farallon Islands. It went from about 5 knots of wind to 35 knots in maybe a minute. Reefed, got set, but something wasn't right. Noah's still on the computer voice saying 5 to 10 knots of wind out of the east, and it wasn't that. And so sort of did the quick math and said we can go for like another hour or two and still turn around and get back in before dark. We'll do that. If it's still windy like this, we're going back. Couple of crew members were disappointed in that because we're all tough guys. We turned around, we went back. The next day it blew 65. So never
I'm
wrong
very
to turn around.
happy to have paid for those plane tickets for everyone to come back instead of having them be at risk.
Yeah. And you have to consider what are the consequences of wrong. This is the confident versus arrogant thing. If getting it wrong can be like this catamaran that ended up on a beach in Washington and Oregon with the crew never found again. This is a boat being delivered up to Puget Sound. They went out in what was forecasted to be bad conditions. Somebody talked to the captain of the crew,
A friend of ours
with
down in San Francisco.
lots of experience, and said, it looks pretty rough. The guy said, I never put my crew in danger. Well, they were never seen again. So what are the consequences? How much of the edge are you pushing? Do you really need to do that? Your guests can wait a day or a couple days at the other end. The boat part that's not quite right, you can take the time to make it right. What are the consequences of getting it wrong? File a float plan. When you're going to go for more than just day coastal hops, make sure people know how to get in touch with you. What communication resources do you have? What is your boat like? Who is on the crew?
And actually, this is something we have a template and be happy to provide copies of. You can just get in touch with us afterwards, but that we've developed in some detail with help from a search and rescue expert. It's evolved a little bit since this one, to be able to include the information that SAR would want to see front and center, but also to actually really think about how you handle the person who is holding your float plan for you, that trustee who is probably not an experienced sailor, it's probably a friend or family member who cares about you, how to help them with information about all of the ways in which things are probably fine, all of the resources they can check, the boats and company, a whole list of things before they actually get to calling the Miami RCC or whatever it is.
Yeah. Very important to have a good float plan. The key point here, when there's a situation, a problem or emergency that happens, these are the variables that affect it. Time, site safety. You don't go run into the burning building. You figure out if you can run into the burning building or you can't run into it. If you take medical classes and they talk about you walk up to somebody who's unconscious in the street or there's a car accident, you assess the situation before you do much else because you can quickly get into more problem. Assess the situation, communication, starting early, make a plan. And then ultimately, this is going to lead to an action. That action you should assess at the end. It's that consequences of wrong. What is the condition of the crew in the boat? Are they all good? Is everybody tired? Is there a boat quirkiness that makes it more complicated? What is the environment that you're in? Is it rough? And repairing something on deck, you're going to be pitched around? Is it benign and flat, calm and easy? And then what is the complexity of the action? And these things together creates this very simple, this is a low risk thing that we're doing. This is a really high risk thing that we're doing. And then your action should be adapted accordingly. And I think I'm only a minute past.
Slightly over, but pretty close. We hope that was helpful. We'd be happy to field any questions that folks have.
Thank you, guys. That was fantastic and very timely considering, you know, we have a lot of people getting ready to go right now. So perfect. And
It's the season.
It is. And I hope that the captains that weren't here will you know, watch the recording. I'll make sure that they get it in an email because I think it's so much important information in here.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that.
And again, we'll take any questions through chat or if anybody wants to.
Or there's our email at the bottom of the screen. If anyone wants a copy of the float plan template, drop us a note. Happy to send it to you. Let's see.
Here's one.
Questions.
In their
Hold
age of
on.
Meridian Go.
Do we still need SSB? So I think there's kind of a personal choice. We will still have an SSB on board. We'll probably find a new home for our Pactor modem because our Iridium Go is our primary offshore data source. But we think it's good to have multiple options for offshore communications. Frankly, I'll get an InReach, a Garmin InReach, probably the little messenger one, the new one that's like $299 and then much cheaper service as a backup to the Go for a secondary communications device. But having the SSB on board, it's nice. It gives you some party line chatting that can be great. If you're going to the Caribbean, it means you can listen in for free on Chris Parker. There's some nice advantages to that. If you're starting from scratch, I wouldn't spend the money on it, frankly. It's not a good use of funds compared to the amount of service and hardware you can get for years and years and years and years with satellite devices.
Our first 6 years or so were SSB and a Pactor modem, and they were great. It was awesome. When we got an Iridium Go for the Indian Ocean, it was easier, it was faster, and it gave us better access to data and specifically weather. It was a better solution.
Another question about whether, have you written in for a magazine? We do write regularly for Cruising World magazine, and we have an article that Jamie authored that touches on a lot of the topics today for safety at sea that was in one of their issues. I forget which one. I think it was last year.
It goes into more detail on that virtual training approach in that article.
Yes, we will say hello if we see you around. Have a good passage, Nancy. Wonderful. Well, if that's it, Tatcha, we will let everyone get on with their evening and just say thank you so much. Truly a pleasure for us to be here, to be part of this. We appreciate the Salty Dog Association for including us in their program, sharing our enthusiasm and our passion really for everyone being safe and comfortable out there on the water.
Have a great passage.
Thank you again. We really appreciate that the timing of this is ideal for us. So thank you.
Great. Be safe, everyone.
Bye now.